We are so pleased that you all are joining us tonight for a panel discussion on the history of the South Dakota State Legislature. And this is prompted by the beginning of the 100th session, which will start next week. And I know you're probably thinking, but the state is older than 100. And you're right. But the sessions were held every other year up until 1960. I think I have that year right. Bernie will correct me if I am wrong. Sorry to admit a few more people there. So please mute yourselves. And I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to ask them some questions. And then we get towards about 7:40 or so. We will open it up for audience questions. And since there are so many of us, I'm going to ask that you type those questions into the chat. So the chat is on your bar, your application bar. On my screen, it's at the bottom. Also, you might want to put your view on speaker so that you can see whoever's speaking in full face instead of just all of the little squares that make me think of the Brady Bunch. And that's how I date myself, Brady Bunch. Okay. So tonight we are so fortunate to have with us three distinguished panelists, each of whom have had a very long history with the state legislature. So we have Terry Woster, who's spent 40 years as a journalist reporting on the annual legislative sessions, and then another 5 years as the information officer for the Department of Public Safety. So 45 years of sessions to tell us all kinds of highlights and things that he's learned and thought about over the years. We also have Bernie Hunhoff, who is the editor-at-large for South Dakota Magazine, and he served as a state senator from Yankton for 12 years. And we have Tony Venhuizen, who is currently a representative from Sioux Falls, and he's, before that, worked in a variety of different state government offices, including the governor's office, and he's done a lot of writing about the state government as well. And Tony and Bernie both have family members who are legislatures. Tony his grandfather was in the legislature for 26 years and is on a picture behind him on the wall there. And Bernie's sister-in-law was also in the state legislature. So they all have a wealth of experiences, their own family members and the studies that they've done and the observations they've made. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Tony, Terry, and Bernie, for agreeing to participate on this panel tonight. So again, please make sure you're muted and not the panelists. So I'm going to start with some more general questions, and then we'll get more specific. And I've asked the panelists they don't need to go in any certain order. Whoever wants to talk, but they'll probably look at each other if they can. Maybe not across the Zoom and see who wants to talk. But I'm going to start with just kind of characterizing the South Dakota State Legislature throughout its previous 99 sessions. What would you say comes to mind if you're thinking of ways to describe or characterize the South Dakota State Legislature?
Go ahead, Terry. You were there for the most of them.
You've been appointed, Terry.
Yeah, I don't mind. I would characterize it, although I missed the first several, as long periods of relatively calm conservatism interrupted by bursts of socialism, which they called, I think, populism or progressivism. But sometimes in the teens, we would create a state loan program called Rural Credits, buy and run a state cement plant, things like that. Things people would say, oh my gosh, you can't do that. We're a conservative state, but we did that for a while. In the 30s, we did push some income tax things that were odd. In the 70s, they did all manner of really pretty cutting edge kind of things with the 4-year med school, with the personnel office and career service protections, with the investment office, the retirement system. I mean, those were things that just came in a burst. And so that's kind of what I think of it. There's kind of a period when we always argue. 。  . 。 . 。 . 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。. 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 .
. . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 .
。 .
.
。
We lost you, Terry.
Terry, he muted.
Uh-oh.
There,
Terry, you
how's
got
it?
muted. Now
Am
I
I
hear you
okay?
back. Sorry about that.
Am I back?
Okay, you're
Okay.
back. Okay.
Somebody did that to me. Anyway, that's my really brief overview.
Okay, so mostly conservative with bursts of populism.
Yeah, that's what I'd say.
All right.
You know,
Tony or Bernie?
Go ahead, Tony.
I'd answer in a little different way. And before I do, thank you all for joining tonight. I'm looking over who's online. I know maybe most of you. I know a lot of these people, and quite a few of you, frankly, would probably be as qualified or more to be panelists as I am. I see Al Novstrup, who's been in the legislature for 22, 23 years, Jim Bolin, Susan Wismer, Harry Christensen was around for a long time. Many of you would be just as qualified, so thank you for joining. You know, I would just say I always like what Matt Michaels would call the session the state fair indoors. And you go there for a very brief period of time, and everything moves very fast. You see different people every day, people going through every day in the rotunda, you see somebody different. It's a very open, accessible process where people can come participate. Uh, uh, I've worked in the governor's office with people whose previous experience was in Congress, working for a congressman or something, and they're just blown away by the pace of it. You know, in Congress, you can file a bill and perhaps never hear of it again, or it'll be months before it has a hearing. In the legislature, you can file a bill and be having a hearing on it within a day or two. It can have been killed within 2 or 3 days of you filing it in the worst case scenario. It is it's all day, every day while you're there. But then the best thing probably about it is that we're there for 40 days or less, and then it's over. I don't know if it's quite the shortest session in the country, but it has to be close. And we get as much done in that period of time as other states do in much, much longer sessions. So I think we can be proud of that.
Well,
You said so many things, Tony. Oh, go ahead, Bernie.
Thanks. No, thanks for including me in the panel, and I'm honored to be on with Terry and Tony. Terry's one of our real, I say it in the nicest way, Terry, a real senior historian of the legislature. And Tony, I'm delighted that we have young legislators like Tony, especially Tony, who's just not only a great legislator, but a really great historian also of South Dakota state government and South Dakota in general. So really appreciate Tony also. And like Tony said, this is a big panel because there's lots of folks here that might have a lot to say, and I look forward to hearing from you guys later. How would I characterize it? I love the answers from Tony and Terry. I would characterize it in a broader sense, though, just as kind of like Matt Michaels suggested with the state fair. I would characterize it as a reflection of South Dakota. And if you're a historian and you read about the very early sessions where some pretty crude characters would show up in the legislature, sometimes wagon masters and hard rock miners and all sorts of characters, some who could barely speak English. And Bob Karlevitz, a great historian in Yankton, wrote once about how there was a big debate once, and they ended up in fisticuffs and swearing, and one legislator threw a chicken carcass at another legislator. So, just crazy stuff like that. And then, maybe that was a reflection of South Dakota in the 1890s. And it gradually became, it's always probably looked a lot like South Dakota. And I saw it myself, and Terry was there when we started to elect more women legislators in the 80s and then in the 90s. And in 1993, when I first went to the legislature, there were quite a few women. I think that's the big reason why we started regulating smoking. You couldn't smoke just anywhere in the Capitol. Before that, the whole building was yellow from the tobacco smoke, and smoke was just all through the hallways and committee rooms. And in 1993, our first year here, at first they said there were no more smoking except for the appropriations hallway. Remember that, Terry? And that didn't last for days, did it? And they moved it. And then they said no more smoking in the appropriations hallway. They moved it to the front steps, and now you can't smoke on the front steps either. So there were party rooms, I think, yet in the 80s and on into the 90s, and it wasn't uncommon. I've heard, I wasn't there in the 80s, but not uncommon maybe for legislators to show up intoxicated. That would be a really rare and a big deal. If that happened today.
Land again. She was my Sunday school teacher.
So I think it's a reflection of the state, I think.
All great answers. The historian in me wants to be taking notes. But I need to moderate. Okay. I think there might be some overlap with this question, but I was thinking about patterns and if there's something, and I think Terry was kind of getting to a pattern with his response about characterizing the legislature with things that you see happening over and over, and maybe then patterns that ceased over time as well. Any thoughts along those lines?
Terry totally nailed the pattern, where you go on for days and weeks and years, maybe even decades, where it doesn't look like a lot is happening, and then all of a sudden, something will trigger something, and things will change very quickly, and maybe ideas or programs that they talked about and killed with hardly any support in previous years, all of a sudden something like that will pass. Here in Yankton, a good example happened right here in Yankton way back in 1899. We created a state mental hospital because other states would no longer take our mentally ill patients because their hospitals were full. So we were just warehousing mentally ill patients in a couple of wood barracks here in Yankton, and just trying to forget about them. And in 1899, on a cold night like this in the winter, a fire broke out, and in one of the barracks, and it was locked, and the women could not escape, and 17 women burned. The legislature happened to be there on a study trip that day, so they were right there when it happened, and they were just infuriated and shocked. And in no time at all, we went from having maybe one of the worst mental illness systems in the country to one of the best. They immediately voted to build a beautiful campus, and they embraced the ideas of a Dr. Mead, who had this way far futuristic idea of how you treat mental illness by putting people in good surroundings and building up their self-esteem. And he wanted a college campus type setting, and it was just a huge change that happened almost overnight. So I think, as Terry said, you see that over and over again, where not much happens. You think nothing's going to happen. Need-based scholarships would be the most recent thing. We argued over need-based scholarships for our colleges for years and years and years, and it looked like they were never going to pass. And then all of a sudden, there was a little extra money a couple of years ago, and they passed without any fanfare at all.
Okay, so long discussion, and then maybe something that moves the pivot to make that discussion become a reality. Would you say that? Is that a fair assessment of what you said, Bernie?
No, exactly right. Exactly right. And just when you think they're too conservative to ever act, they'll do some pretty progressive things.
And there we go.
I mean, look at tourism. What we did with tourism would be another great example. I mean, Peter Norbeck set aside Custer State Park, and then we supported Mount Rushmore, and all of a sudden we created a state tourism system that's really heavily state supported and state organized, and it's just an amazing success story. Shows you what even conservative people, what we can do as a state when we all come together and agree on something. Tourism has never been very politicized in South Dakota, and it's been a real strength of our state. And I think you have to give the legislature some credit for never letting that become politicized, and making some really strategic and smart investments through the decades.
I hadn't thought about tourism that way, so kudos to the legislature.
Okay.
You have any additions to that, Tony? Oh, Terry's going to jump in. Great.
Oh, I just think that's it's kind of a pendulum that swings, and for a long time it seems to be swinging one way. You argue, and then, as Bernie said, a spark is maybe a fire, maybe a sudden need. I remember people arguing about lottery, and it was so outlandish that it hardly made a bill for years, and then all of a sudden we have lottery everywhere because we found a need and they found a way to fund it. And then we argued about video lottery for a long time, and every year they fought about how much to take. And I think it was when Bill Janko came in, he said, look, 50-50. And I don't know if that was fair, but it sounded fair. And so not everybody liked it, but that's how you end up. You get a moment for some reason when all of a sudden something that couldn't be done is done. I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, I think that's politics in a nutshell. Something inexplicable sometimes about it comes out in human relations
Yeah.
in a way. Tony, what would you add about patterns?
Well, I think they've covered a lot of it. You know, if you look at more of the side of the political control, of course, generally very Republican controlled. The periods where the Democrats have tended to take control or increase their influence historically was when the farm economy was bad. 1890s, they had the populist takeover. 1920s and 30s with the Depression, the Democrats took over. The late 50s. Um, that's less so in the last 40 years or so, I think, as we've seen, farms get bigger, and so there are fewer farmers voting as a block compared to the rest of the state. But the other thing you see is even when the Republicans are in control, you have these kind of highs and lows. We right now are at kind of a historic high for Republican control with the new legislature that starts next week only has 9 Democrats, and I've been thinking for about 10 years that the Republicans have probably topped out, and we continue to inch a little higher. But that was true last in the 1950s. There was in the early 50s, after 1952, there were only 2 Democrats. It was 108 to 2. By the late 50s, the Democrats had George McGovern and Ralph Herseth had been elected governor, and they'd taken control of the Senate. So these things come and go. And, for most of the time that Bernie was in the legislature, for example, the kind of Janklow Rounds years, you averaged a situation where the Republicans had maybe 2/3, maybe not quite. The Democrats have around a third, and that seems to be kind of the historical norm. And where we stray from that one way or the other, we revert to the norm. So right now we are, like Terry said, at one extreme here. You have to think that someday that comes back to the more historical norm. But
Certainly an interesting pattern, and we'll see how that bears out, I guess, in the next decade. Thanks for that, all three of you. I'm going to move on to the next question, and we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit from South Dakota and think about how the South Dakota state legislature compares to other state legislatures. Maybe we could think about that in the part-time versus full-time. Some of you have looked at that question before.
yeah, I'd take that first if it's okay, because I
Absolutely.
hit on a little bit of that in one of my earlier answers. A lot of states claim to have a part-time legislature, but by part-time, they mean they meet 6 months or 8 months, or they meet so much that you can't really plausibly have another job. There are not that many states that would say that they have a full-time legislature, but there are quite a few that do in practice. We really do have a part-time legislature. We meet for 9 weeks, starting next week this year. 4 days a week now. That was a change about 20 years ago to the 4-day week. Really set up so people can have other jobs and be back and forth. In addition to that, the short session and the part-time nature. I would also mention we have a central professional staff that serves the legislature as a group. The legislators really don't have their own staff at all. And that is very different from, with the exception of maybe North Dakota, just about anywhere else. You go to most places and it's more like visiting Congress, where you got to get an appointment, and now you're going to talk to this guy's chief of staff, and if he wants to bring a bill with some other guy, my chief of staff's going to talk to Bernie's chief of staff, and maybe eventually we'll talk. No. In Pierre, most of us don't even have offices. We just have our desk on the floor of the house, and if you want to talk to somebody, you just go talk to them, and there isn't this layer of staff. That makes us less efficient in some ways. I mean, you got to answer all your own mail, email, and on the other hand, it also removes a layer of you can make the argument that one of the problems in Congress is that the people doing a lot of the work are these 25-year-old kids, kind of their first job. That in Pierre, it's really the people who are elected doing the work themselves and dealing with each other. And I think that's a really valuable feature of our process.
Well, then I'll just say that I went to Albany, New York after one of our sessions, and I spent a week there just wandering around looking at their legislature. And in a week, I saw one floor session and 2 committee meetings, and they were working full time. And by Monday noon, I'd have seen almost that much in here, or more. I'd have seen more than I could get to. There's no way to really compare what happens in Pierre with what happens in some of the other states. It's just you hit the ground at 7:30 or 7, and you walk out at 7 or 9 at night, and in between you're doing something. Whether you're a reporter or a legislator or a lobbyist or somebody up from Canton or Chamberlain just trying to find their legislator and get 10 minutes, it's hectic.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I think the result of all of what Tony and Terry just described, the result of all that, the benefit for the public is accessibility. I think Tony kind of hinted to that. Legislators here are so much more accessible because you don't have those layers that Tony talked about, and because you've got a very busy schedule, as Terry talked about. I mean, anybody can show up in Pierre, and you just as a bystander, you could be as busy as you want to be, hopping from committee room to committee room, talking to legislators out on the steps and in the hallways. That doesn't happen in I can't speak for all 50 states, but in the legislatures that I've visited, it's not that way. You'd be hard pressed, I think, in a lot of states to walk into a state capitol and to find a legislator who you could stop and who would talk to you for a bit. I tried to pass a bill in the Nebraska legislature, and I mean, they were all nice enough, but it was nothing like Pierre, where you could just go up and really bend people's ear and make your argument. Accessibility, I think, is what is the end result of all that.
Sounds like it's really tied to this concept that we hear a lot, citizen lawmaker. And one of our comments that we're already getting comments that is talking about that too, and how much. And I think that I'm trying to remember, and I've read recently pieces by Terry and pieces by Bernie, and I'm trying to remember which one talked about this concept, and maybe you both did, but that seems very close, very tied to that understanding of citizenship, and that anybody can walk in and come find their representative or their senator, and that on the other side of that, the senator or representative is going to listen intently to their constituents or whoever it is finds them, because they might live next door or across the street or be related to you. Right? All right. Those are great answers. Really interesting. How about the structure of the legislature? I know there have been changes across these 99 sessions. What changes in the structure have made a significant impact?
I'll go first if you want. I think, and Tony, I think, referred to it. The Legislative Research Council brought a level of professionalism that, if it existed, it was uneven, to say the least. I don't want to say negative things, but it brought people who knew bill drafting, people who knew law, people who knew where to find laws and how to write laws and how to do them. I mean, it was just, that was one of the things that I think was one of the signature structural moves. The other one that I like was after the 1970 session, when the census came out, the legislature had 30, at that time when I first joined, they had 35 senators and 75 House members, which made no sense at all, but that's the way it was. And so they cut the House to 7, so they could draw the districts all being 35. And that in itself was important, but more important was, I think it helped the impetus 10 years later or so to single member districts, where they split up Sioux Falls, Rapid City, and Aberdeen, so that you voted before that, you would vote for the top 10 House members in Minnehaha County, whether they were Democrat or Republican, which is how the Democrats got that sweep in '72, because I think it went from 9 Republicans and 1 Democrat before to 8 or 9 Democrats and 1 Republican. Well, you can't do that with single member districts because you only get to vote for your 1 and your 2 House members. And that was wonderful, good government. J.P. Hendrickson and Bill Farber always talked about what a good government idea that was. But it's bad for getting swings of any significance in the voting. But I think for good government, that came out to be a really positive thing.
What else? Tony or
You know,
Bernie?
I think in the overall long span of the legislature, a big thing has been, I think if you read way back about legislators going to Pierre, you know, that was more than 105 then, I forget the number, but you know, they would go out there and they would be many of them would stay for the duration, for weeks, or maybe go home once or twice. And they would be, you know, all out there together alone. Not many other people came out to testify because the roads were not that good. You didn't have, at one time, didn't even have telephones or good phone service. I mean, they were really isolated out there in Pierre doing their thing. And then you might say the legislature was those 100 or whatever number of legislators there were. Today, I think you'd have to say the legislature is no longer just those 105 legislators, and that's really a good thing. The legislature, just like Michael's State Fair is not just, you know, it's not just a carnival. It's everybody that comes to the state fair, the people and everybody. The legislature is now open to everybody, and they're showing up. It seems more and more and more in person because the roads are better, or they can get away, or better travel, or they can now call in and testify on bills, or follow bills online. So the ability of just regular citizens to be a part of the legislative process, which is their legislative process, has just grown exponentially over the decades.
Really interesting. Yeah.
I'd mention 2 other things that I think are key. The first one, and maybe we may as well bring it up now, maybe it would come up later too, is term limits. That passed about 30 years ago, and then it took 8 years for people to be term limited. So the first term limits really hit in 2000. That has been a big change, not so much in the level of turnover. If you look at that, turnover is about 1/3 every 2 years, and that hasn't changed much. And not really in the total experience in terms of average experience, but what it really has changed is how the legislative leadership works. It used to be, and you mentioned my grandpa when you were introducing me, he was in the legislature for 26 years. He was in for 14 years before he got to be appropriations chair, and then he was appropriations chair for 12, which was a little longer than the norm. But the point is, you had to be there for 10 years before they even thought of you for a leadership position. And then once you got it, you had it for at least 6 or 8 years, maybe more. Now, because we're limited to 8 years in a house at a time, you know, our leaders have only been there for a term or two when they get picked, and then they only are in leadership for a term or two, and then they're out. So you have a class of legislative leaders that turns over much faster and has a lot less experience. Since term limits took effect, the only majority or minority leader who served more than 4 years is Bernie, who I think served 6. He's the only one. There hasn't been any on the Republican side. The other thing I would mention is the changes to the technology have brought. And I was remembering when I was a Senate page, the legislature was still very paper-based. There were all these blue and yellow binders everywhere with copies of all the bills. Bernie and Terry both remember this. I think maybe every legislator had their own set of bills, or maybe 2 shared one or something. The journals were on every desk, and the pages had a huge job because they had to go around every day and shuffle all this paper in and out. And then they would mail, the pages didn't do this, but the legislature would mail this stuff to all the courthouses. So you could go to the courthouse in Armour, where I'm from, and you could see all the bills and all the journals as of be a day or 2 out of date, of course. That was how people could be connected. Well, today it's totally different. It was in the late 90s they started putting all that stuff online. Now they don't print any of them anymore. Interestingly, I learned the other day we still have all the blue and yellow binders. They've never got rid of them. They're in the basement. If anybody wants a set, but it's all online. Anybody in the world can look up a bill just as fast as I can. The legislature uses the same system that the public uses to look this stuff up. That was quickly followed a year or two later by South Dakota Public Broadcasting streaming all the meetings. So now you have live audio of every meeting that happens, every floor session. It's all archived. You can go back and listen to it years later. We're starting to do video now too. And then really, and this is largely because of the COVID pandemic, now we allow remote testimony most of the time. So you often don't even need to come to Pierre to participate anymore. We're getting to have more and more people who just call in just like I am right now on Zoom and offer their testimony. And it's not a day-long commitment to come to Pierre to participate anymore. It's the 20 minutes it takes to log in and give your piece and go off. So what was by rule a very accessible process has become because of technology, I think, just an exceptionally transparent process and easy to participate in.
Tony, you used to hear about the pocket veto where certain committee chairs would take a bill and just literally stick it in their pocket, right, and never even give it it never even saw the light of day. At some point, we passed a law that said that every bill deserved a hearing and would get a hearing. But at one time, they even had pocket vetoes. That's how far we've come with transparency.
Now that rule change.
We have a couple of questions that I was going to wait till the end, but they're really appropriate to this discussion about structural changes. So I'm going to throw them out. So the switch from every other year to an annual session. I know that was before your time, everybody's time. But any let's historically a sense of what kind of change that brought from having every other year to annual session?
Well,
Any idea why that switch was made?
I'm from what I've read, one of the drivers was they wanted the second session, the short session, to be limited to appropriations measures primarily. So the long session, you would do policy, state issues, 45 days, and then the short session, 30, you would do the budget. I believe the first short session was 64. Right. And by the time I got there in 1970, there were almost as many bills in the short session as the long, because, as I said, if a legislator sees a day, he has a bill. So it didn't really work the way they thought. But so the smarter thing they did, I think, was to make the sessions of equal length. I mean, I think we got too complex for just one long session, one short, and so we couldn't go back to every other year. But equal length made sense.
There's always been a give and take between second floor and third floor, the legislative branch and the executive branch in South Dakota, and the legislative branch has always been the weaker branch, partly because they meet so infrequently, and when they met every other year, they were even weaker. So I've got to think that I wasn't around, obviously, in the 60s when they did this, but I've got to think that really strengthened the legislative branch a lot, and as did LRC and some of the other changes that we're talking about. It just gave a lot more strength to the legislators. It also probably took some power away from committee chairs, because I think when they met every other year, they gave more power to committee chairs who could act in the absence of the legislature, and so it gave more power to the governor and to a few legislators.
Yeah, and if you think about the sequence, it used to be you get elected in November, you come to session January, February, March, and then your service is basically over. Now until you run, if you want to run again, a year and a half later. So it creates, like Bernie said, a little more continuity in terms of you have a second session, you have more interim meetings between the two, and there's more of a continuous engagement from legislators than I think there was back in those days.
What about, as another question that comes off of what we were just talking about a moment ago with term limits, and Is the lack of experience because of the term limits hurting the effectiveness of the legislature? That's the question. Thank you, Kay Brown.
Well, Bernie, you were kind of there for both
Yeah.
sides of that.
Yeah, and I think like so many things in life, there are pluses and minuses. I sympathize with somebody who wants to run for the legislature and they're up against a 10 or 20 year incumbent. You know, it's really tough to do. On the other hand, when I first went in '93, I just missed Tony's grandpa, but some of what we called the old bulls were around yet. And Lars wasn't that old, but Lars Herseth and Roger McKellips and Harold Halverson and Jim Dunn, Lindell Peterson, really, really great legislators who offered so much. And you don't get that kind of seniority and leadership, I'm afraid, like you did back then. Still a lot of really good people in the legislature, and the turnover is a good thing in many ways. But you would gain some really, really strong leaders under the old system.
Yeah, and it's valuable to have a few who've been around a long time, and we still do. I mean, I mentioned Al Novstrip on this call has been around now since 2002, I think, by going back and forth between the houses. Jim Bolin just finished 16 years, of course. Jean Hunhoff, Bernie's sister-in-law, just ended a 24-year career. And those are definitely, you maybe wouldn't want everybody in the legislature to have been there for 24 years, but it doesn't hurt to have a few.
And I'm guessing maybe the voters are kind of sorting it out okay. It seems like those who hang around are pretty strong legislators. Wouldn't you say, Tony and Terry?
Yeah, they don't. You don't stay if they really don't want you. I knew a guy from Sioux Falls who served in the Senate, finally got beat, and he went around saying, "I left the legislature for my health. They were sick of me." And you get the word, but yeah, it's. I mean, with term limits, like Tony kind of referred to, if you're not on a leadership track your second term, you're not going to make it because you're done. And early on, the only person I saw leadering that fast was George Mickelson when he came in '75. He was, Joe Barnett was there from Aberdeen, a pretty savvy legislator, and he decided to take this guy under his wing and make, 2 sessions later, Mickelson speaker. So, I mean, two terms later, at second session, he's pro tem, and third term, he's speaker, and then he's done. So you could do that once in a while, but most people, it was truly freshmen were seen, and if they were heard, they were in trouble.
Funny. It's been such a great discussion. I'm going to go on to asking you to think about what have been the legislature's greatest achievements.
I can do that real quickly.
Okay.
It was opening the process. I think they passed many great bills and they did many things, but for long-term citizen involvement, citizen understanding, opening the committees, requiring bills to be posted ahead of time, requiring a hearing on every bill, as onerous as that could get sometimes, it still made sure that people knew, if they cared to look, what was going on. And Bernie mentioned a pocket veto. My first session, I saw a senator come roaring across on the last day for bills and march up to the speaker's podium and grab the speaker by his lapels and say, "Where's my bill?" because it hadn't showed up. And after a little give and take, the speaker went back into his office and came out with the bill, which he'd just left in his drawer. That kind of thing doesn't happen. I mean, there are so many improvements that are just based on how they opened it that I think that's the biggest accomplishment they've made. Some were dragged kicking and screaming, but a lot of them who didn't think it could be done wanted to do it and see, like Joe Barnett, for example. He wasn't able to move his party quite that far, but when the Democrats were pushing it, he worked really hard with no credit to help make sure that happened. And I think there are a lot of others who did that too. It was a marvelous thing.
You know, I agree with Terry, and I want to add a little more to that story. The State Historical Society over the last couple of years has been doing a project of doing video oral histories of people who were involved in politics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And two of the people who we interviewed for that were Jean LeBrun, who passed away a little over a year ago, and Larry Pearsall, now Judge Pearsall, who back in the 73, 74 session, which is the last time the Democrats controlled the House, Jean LeBrun was the speaker and Pearsall was the majority leader. Now I say majority, but the Terry mentioned they had changed the House to have 70 members. And at the time they did that, the one objection was, well, if we have an odd or an even number, couldn't we have a tie? So, well, that's so unlikely. We don't have to worry about that. Sure enough, the very first election after they changed it, they ended up with a 35 to 35 tie. Rules say that when that happens, that the governor's party gets to consider themselves the majority, even though they're really not, it's a tie. So the Democrats had a 35-35 quote unquote majority. But I was able to conduct the interview of Judge Pearsall, and he said very much what Terry said, that when the Democrats took control, they also took the Senate by a vote or two, they wanted to make these structural changes. Every bill gets a hearing. You have to post these meetings ahead of time. The public have to be open. And Joe Barnett basically came to them and said, look, as Republicans, we could never make this change when we were in the majority, but I will make sure that you get it done. He knew it was the right thing to happen. And that's the last time that the Democrats controlled both houses. They have controlled the Senate once since then. I think Bernie's first term, maybe. Mm-hmm. But that really set the path for a lot of what makes our legislature special in the last 50 years, were those changes that were made.
It's interesting that neither Tony or Terry, when you ask for their greatest achievements, you don't list a bill, and I think that is so true. I've talked to so many old legislators, and we joke about, once they're gone 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's like Louis L'Amour, the Western writer, said, it's like sticking your finger in a river. You pull your finger out, and that's how much change you've had in the river. Yep. That's kind of the way you feel about the bills. But I think just the fact that we've strengthened the process through the years, as Tony and Terry both hit on, strengthened the process, opened it up, made sure that everybody was heard, not just legislators, but the public as a whole. We've made it more open. I really think I love this about the state legislature. I think a lot of people show up there in Pierre, especially for the first time, and they're pretty nervous about it. They don't know if they're going to be listened to or respected. And I think in most cases, I'd like to think, and it's been my experience, in most cases, they're pretty surprised that they are listened to and they are respected. Maybe not always agreed on. Maybe their bill doesn't pass, or they don't get it killed if they want to kill it. But they don't always get their way, just like most legislators don't always get their way. But they're part of the process and they're respected, and that's no small thing. And I'd say maybe one of the great achievements.
Hey, so how about let's turn that over. What do you think are some of the areas in which the legislature has fallen short?
I said before we started, I'm sure Bernie has more of these than I do. So,
we're calling on Bernie.
I know a lot of my Republican friends think, Bernie and the Democrats must be so unhappy. But as we talked about earlier, I've had to buck up Democrat legislators through the years, to give them pep talks and get them excited about being part of the process, because you think we're all beaten down. But actually, it's not the case. As we've talked about earlier, you introduce a good, sensible, progressive idea in the legislature, and it lays there sometimes for years and maybe sometimes for decades, but eventually it takes root. And if it's a good idea, it passes. The most recent example would be the need-based scholarships. Democrats, fought and fought and fought for that for years and got almost no votes. But I think everybody was starting to realize, as Joe Barnett probably did with some of the processes you were talking about, I think everybody was starting to think it really does make sense. I think we're the only state in the nation at that point that didn't have one. And all of a sudden, a couple of years ago, it just passes without hardly a debate. So I think overall, Democrats, if they're students of history, should not be that unhappy with the course of events in the state legislature. The one thing I think we've really fallen short of, and I would say that's true of all rural states, is that somehow I wish our citizen legislature could have somehow had more impact on the corporate industrialization of agriculture and the effects it's had on our economy, in our culture, in our natural resources. It's just been profound. And our poor farmers and ranchers have just been strangled at both ends by people who sell them the feed and seed and machinery on one end at retail prices, and just strangle them with monopolistic prices at the other end. And I just think it's had a huge impact on our state. And if you look around the rest of the world, you've got cases where family farms and ranches have done well, and they've maintained the benefits locally. And we've just, I think, just have not addressed that. The legislature has tackled it at times with bills like, we passed a bill a couple of years ago to allow farmers to at least work on their own tractors. I think I'm simplifying that, but some bill along that line. We've passed, meat labeling bills, and we tried to get into it, and all well intentioned, but I think our citizen legislature has just been very poorly equipped to take on maybe the biggest issue of our day.
A shortfall that I would see, and I think this is pretty common for legislative bodies. I don't think it's a particular failing of ours, but the capacity for kind of more long-term thinking or planning. We have a short, fast session. We have 2-year terms, quite a bit of turnover. It's very easy and very common to fall into the looking ahead a year or two, and there are some issues where that doesn't really. I'd use the issue of water quality, which is one that I've heard come up from time to time for a long time. And that's one that you can't really affect in a session to. There's no bill you could bring this year that would fix it by next year. And so, it's so big that I think people kind of struggle to see, we do these summer studies, say, but they meet maybe 3 or 4 days, and they can do so much, but not. I just think institutionally we're not very set up for that. What that leads to a certain extent, is that a lot of that type of thinking really comes from the governor's office and the legislature. And some governors have been better about that than others. And so you can have, you just don't see that kind of leadership coming from the legislative body. Now, we certainly don't see that from Congress either, or from, I think maybe that's just the nature of a legislative body. I don't think it's a particular failing of our state, but.
Yeah. If I saw a shortcoming, and it's kind of it might be unfair, but I think the legislature has been, for years, both parties, afraid to build its own staff. They don't want to look like they're going toward full time, but I do think there are several areas where the Legislative Research Council should have more bodies, more staff. They could use even more on appropriations. They could use more, just doing what Tony said, looking ahead. They used to write some white papers, but maybe they could do those long term. We're talking about taking water from the Missouri River to Rapid City. Well, that opens, my gosh, that's massive, and it should be a 10, 20-year plan, and it should be the legislature or the legislature staff kind of leading the way on that, because I still think they're closest to the people, and they're the people most likely to get accosted on the street or in the coffee shop if people don't like what they're doing. So if I had that, I would say they're afraid to spend resources to make sure they can keep up on what they need to do long term.
I'm going to throw out one question from our chat that kind of follows along with, I think what Tony said, that sometimes with the short terms and the amount of turnover, and that it's often the governor's office and that's able to look more long term. And so the question is, to what extent did the governor affect, or does the governor affect legislatures and the legislators passing laws?
it's not, it wouldn't just be the governor, but the governor's staff, the cabinet secretaries and the department staff. Sometimes there's been some kickback. Legislators are a little overwhelmed, not so much by the governor and the governor's staff, but by all the bureaucrats that are in Pierre and having fact, there's what I think there's like 400 or 500 lobbyists already who register for a legislative session, and a good share of those probably are government lobbyists, people coming from the various departments who just have time, who have the time, and let's face it, they have a strong vested interest in legislation, and they exert a real profound influence. And I'm not saying it's all bad. I mean, they provide good information. They're good people with good intentions, providing good information, but it's a strong influence on the legislature, and very frustrating to citizens who come to Pierre and find out that they're facing, a dozen bureaucrats if they're trying to do something. You may or may not disagree with them.
In addition to that, there's usually, there's maybe 500 bills filed in a given session. That can vary some, but a decent chunk of those are bills brought by the executive branch. That can be 50 or 80 bills maybe, brought on behalf of the governor or executive agencies. And so then you have the agency staff, the public lobbyists, who are called blue badges because the name tags they wear are blue rather than white. And they're up there, it's their bills. They're the one carrying it. A lot of times those bills are not, sometimes they're the more routine, non-controversial bills, but not always. Sometimes they're very controversial. So you see the executive branch bringing their own bills that they're carrying forward. And then a lot of engagement from the executive branch on testifying on other bills where they're, kind of to Terry's last point about the legislature having a very small staff. There are a lot of issues where really the subject matter expert on a particular matter within state government is going to be somebody in a cabinet department. And so someone from the Department of Revenue or Game Fish and Parks or wherever is the one who gets drug up there to explain what's going on or why it works the way it was. And so, yes, just in terms of the functioning of the legislature, it's a big factor. Even if you set aside the obvious political side of a governor coming in and advancing his own agenda and her own agenda and pushing the bills and moving that forward, they definitely are a part of the process, a key part of the process.
Yeah.
I'm going to have us wrap up. Oh, go ahead, Terry.
No, I was just going to say the governor obviously has an interest in everything that's going to go on, because when the legislators are gone, the bills become law or don't become law. But I was just thinking of a story. I remember the press secretary for Governor Mickelson told me when he first came in, a legislator stopped down to run a bill past him and asked if it was okay if he introduced it. And Governor Mickelson afterward said to his press secretary, "Why did he ask me? He's a legislator." Well, because over the years, some legislators had become used to getting, a pre-look on what they can do. And in a sense, that's because they want to know if they're going to get submarines, and they want to know if they can get the support, because that matters. As Bernie said, there's a whole bunch of blue badges out there. Back my last year with public safety, I had a blue badge. I never went to the legislature and testified because that would have been a bad thing all around, but I had one.
We're getting close to the end of our hour, so I want us to cap this off with the favorite legislative session stories or the thing that you find most fascinating or unique.
Well, I'll just finish by saying I just think that the 100th session anniversary, which is going to go on next year, this year we're in 2025, is important for this reason. I really do think we have something special, as you probably figured out by my comments. I think that we have something really special with our citizen legislature. I think it's one of the strengths of South Dakota. Thomas Paine, the great philosopher and founding father of our country, said society is a blessing, government is a necessary evil. I think the legislature is a kind of a bridge between society and government, and it's a real strength, and it works in South Dakota. It doesn't work perfectly. I wrote a story for our magazine about how it's imperfect, but it's about the best thing we got going. And I just think that we should recognize this year why it's unique and valuable, and we should really make an effort to keep it that way. Thanks for having me.
You know, my favorite story is in Bernie's article, South Dakota Magazine.
I was going to hold up
I'm not
mine
gonna
too.
I'm not going to tell it to you because you should go get it if you haven't, because the story that Bernie wrote for this is the current, it's on newsstands now. I saw it in Hy-Vee yesterday. The article Bernie wrote about the 100th legislative session is really very, very good and has a lot of great stories from one that I told him, but from a lot of people. And if you're on this meeting, I strongly suspect that you would enjoy it. I'd also mention, I know the Historical Society Press is going to be putting out a book when, Dedra, in April?
Early April.
For the 100th session, which is a collection of articles that have been written over the years for South Dakota history about the legislature. But the introduction to that book was written by Terry Woster, and I've had the chance to have a preview of that, and that was very well done as well. So we're very lucky that we have two of our state's best writers, Terry and Bernie, here helping us memorialize this.
And Bernie's allowing us to include his article from South Dakota Magazine in that book as well.
Oh, good.
Proud to be
Good. I didn't know that. Thank you.
So that'll be the preface. Yes. And while we're tooting horns, members will have gotten this in the mailbox, the winter issue of South Dakota History, our quarterly journal, and it is a special issue on the 100th session.
Starting to
So
seem
we have
like
all kinds of fun stuff for you all to look at. So any final fun stories?
Wait, I've got one story.
It will end on.
At the end of the 1976 session, the Democrats still held the Senate, I think 19-16, but the Republicans had taken back the House 37-33. And on the final day, the Senate everybody was getting ready to go home. They were packed up. They were glad hen and having great times. The Senate had passed the appropriations bill, which was the last thing they had to do. All they were waiting was for the House to rubber stamp it and send it back. But in the House at 2 or 3 in the afternoon on the Friday, Walt Miller, then legislator from New Underwood, proposed a 2% cut across the board in all state spending, and it passed. So they sent it back to the Senate for agreement with that slight change, and the Senate didn't. And the general appropriations bill went into a conference committee of 3 members from each house, and they met all night Friday into Saturday, into Sunday morning. Finally, Sunday afternoon, Joe Barnett came to his caucus and said, "We can't win this, and we're starting to look silly. It's time to go home." But what I remember most was late Friday night, there was no fast food then in Pierre, but there was a D&E cafe that was open 24 hours. Some group of legislators somehow had ordered 100-some hamburgers to be delivered up to the Capitol. But at about 2:30 in the morning, I was in the House chamber talking to Lowell Hanson. We're the only people around, and a guy came in with this massive box and said, "Who ordered the hamburgers?" Well, we were the only ones there at that time, but Lowell said, "Well, I'll take one." And I said, "Yeah, me too." But I don't know what the other 100 got done with, but that was my favorite part of that story. Yeah, we'll have a burger at 3 in the morning. And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And everyone, please join me in thanking our panelists.